Why do certain songs grow on us the more we hear them? Why do some people seem more likable after a few encounters? Why do we lean toward brands we've seen repeatedly, even without consciously thinking about their quality? The answer lies in a psychological phenomenon known as the mere exposure effect. This concept not only explains the subtle ways our preferences are shaped, but also offers valuable lessons for those looking to build lasting habits and self-discipline. In this video, we'll dive into what the mere exposure effect is and how you can harness it to develop a disciplined, healthy lifestyle. The mere exposure effect, sometimes called the familiarity principle, is a psychological phenomenon where people tend to develop a preference for things simply because they're familiar with them. The effect is subtle, as we often don't realize it's happening. Repeated exposure to a stimulus, whether it's a person, a sound, a brand, or an idea, can increase our liking for it over time, even if our initial reaction was neutral or mildly negative. That's because repeated, passive exposure makes the unfamiliar feel safe and familiar, quietly shifting our preferences over time. This is one of the key features of mere exposure effect. The effect occurs through repeated, passive exposure to a stimulus, often without our conscious awareness. It can apply to nearly anything: people, objects, sounds, or even abstract concepts. Over time, this repeated exposure naturally leads to increased preference and more positive feelings toward whatever we encounter frequently. The mere exposure effect was first identified by Robert Zajonc, a social psychologist, in the 1960s. In his experiments, participants consistently rated stimuli, including nonsense words, Chinese characters, and unfamiliar images, more favorably after multiple exposures. One of his landmark studies in 1968 demonstrated that the more often people were exposed to certain images, the more positively they rated them, regardless of content. Modern neuroscience research using functional magnetic resonance imaging has revealed that familiar stimuli consistently activate brain regions associated with pleasure, comfort, and reward. Building on this, a 2005 study by Weeks, Longenecker, McKinney, and more found that repeated exposure to ethically questionable scenarios made individuals more likely to view those behaviors as acceptable. This highlights how mere exposure can subtly influence ethical judgments and decision-making over time. The business world has long capitalized on this effect. Studies confirm that consumers tend to prefer advertisements, products, and influencers they encounter regularly, often without consciously realizing it. Whether it's a jingle you can't get out of your head or a face that keeps appearing in your social feed, familiarity alone can drive preference. The mere exposure effect isn't just an academic curiosity, it's a practical tool for habit building and cultivating self-discipline. Self-discipline thrives on familiarity. The more you expose yourself to productive habits and healthy routines, the more natural and effortless they become over time. The effect gradually reduces our mental resistance to new or unfamiliar things. When we first encounter something, whether it's a new habit, routine, or environment, our brains instinctively treat it with caution. But as repeated exposure makes the experience more familiar, that initial resistance begins to fade. At the same time, familiarity brings a subtle sense of emotional reward. As something becomes more predictable and recognizable, it feels safer and more comfortable. Our brains are wired to favor what's familiar because it requires less cognitive effort to process and is less likely to pose a threat. This creates a quiet, positive association that strengthens over time. Perhaps most importantly, the mere exposure effect encourages consistency by lowering the psychological effort required to stick with the behavior. New habits feel difficult not because they're inherently unpleasant, but because they demand more attention and willpower. As repeated exposure turns these behaviors into familiar patterns, the effort needed to maintain them decreases, making it far easier to stay consistent over the long run. We can see this process play out in countless everyday situations. When you first decide to start waking up at 5:30 a.m., it feels jarring and unpleasant. Your brain instinctively pushes back because the experience is unfamiliar and disrupts your established routine. But as you persist and repeatedly expose yourself to those early mornings, your mind gradually adjusts. The strangeness fades, and what once felt difficult begins to feel normal. Over time, you stop dreading the early alarm and might even come to enjoy the calm, focused hours before the rest of the world wakes up. The same pattern happens with changes to eating habits. Imagine skipping your usual afternoon snack. At first, it triggers hunger, irritability, and a mild sense of deprivation because your body and mind are used to expecting food at that time. But with repeated exposure to those snack-free afternoons, your cravings weaken. Each time you successfully resist, the experience becomes a little easier. Eventually, your body and brain adjust to the new routine, accepting it as the new normal without protest. These simple, repetitive experiences reinforce new habits by making them feel natural and familiar. Through mere exposure, what was once uncomfortable or unwelcome transforms into an accepted, even appreciated, part of your daily life. It's this gradual, subconscious shift that makes the mere exposure effect such a powerful tool for developing self-discipline. Not every habit benefits equally from repeated exposure, but many routines tied to self-discipline are perfect candidates for this effect. Simple, consistent behaviors that initially feel awkward or demanding often become easier and more natural through passive familiarity. Waking up early is a classic example, as are habits like cutting out late-night screen time or making a habit of drinking more water throughout the day. These behaviors may trigger mild discomfort or resistance at first, but repeated exposure softens that reaction over time. Other routines that respond well to this process include daily reading, journaling, mindful breathing exercises, or brief meditation sessions. Financial tracking and sticking to regular meal schedules follow a similar pattern, initially tedious, but gradually becoming second nature. Even something as simple as maintaining a clean, minimalist workspace or avoiding impulse online purchases benefits from regular exposure. The more consistently you engage with these habits, the more familiar and effortless they feel. Interestingly, the mere exposure effect doesn't require direct action every time. Passive exposure to supportive cues like seeing motivational quotes or gentle visual reminders helps reinforce familiarity with your desired behaviors. Each time you encounter those cues, it reduces the mental resistance to taking action, making it progressively easier to stick with your routines. That said, while the mere exposure effect is powerful, it isn't foolproof. A few common mistakes tend to derail progress. One major pitfall is overexposure. Too much of a good thing can quickly become irritating or stale. If you bombard yourself with constant reminders or repeat an activity too frequently without variation, it risks creating boredom or even aversion. Balance is essential. Another danger is creating negative associations. If the exposure experience is consistently paired with unpleasant emotions, frustration, guilt, or pressure, it can reverse the intended effect. To harness the power of familiarity, it's important to keep the environment and associations around your habits positive. A frequent misunderstanding involves confusing exposure with action. Simply seeing a motivational quote or a workout video isn't enough to build discipline. While passive exposure softens resistance, it needs to be paired with small, consistent actions to produce lasting change. The mere exposure effect primes your brain to be more receptive, but it's the follow-through that builds new habits. Inconsistency is another common issue. Random, sporadic exposure won't create the same positive familiarity as regular, predictable encounters. Consistency strengthens the sense of normalcy and ease that's crucial for long-term habit formation. Finally, it's important to remember personal differences. People vary in how quickly they adapt to new routines. Some may find themselves comfortable after just a few repetitions, while others need more time and exposure. Being patient with yourself and adjust at your own pace. The mere exposure effect is a simple, powerful tool for building self-discipline. By gradually making new habits feel familiar, it reduces resistance and makes positive routines easier to maintain. That said, it's essential to approach this process with balance, patience, and consistency. And most importantly, honor your personal pace. In a world where motivation can fade quickly, the mere exposure effect reminds us that familiarity is a powerful ally. By creating small, steady points of contact with the habits you want to build, you're giving your brain a chance to ease into change without force or strain. Stay consistent and patient, and trust that in time, what feels unnatural today can become second nature tomorrow. Thank you for watching this video. See you next time.